After the loss of the War of the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon had been exiled to Elba. But less than 10 months later, he left Elba and took over the French government again. As a consequence, both the United Kingdom and Prussia sent out armies to stop Napoleon. The Anglo-Allied army under the command of the Duke of Wellington had a total of 93,000 men. His army consisted of soldiers from the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and various German states. His two corps were commanded by the Duke of Oranje, who would later become the King of the Netherlands, Lord Hill. His reserve would be commanded by Picton. The Prussian army under command of Blücher had a total of 116,000 men. The army was subdivided into 4 corps under the command of von Zieten, Pirch, Thielemann, and von Bülow. Napoleon had gathered an army of 128,000 men. His left flank was commanded by Marshal Ney, while his right was commanded by Grouchy. Napoleon himself was commanding the center. Since a combined Anglo-Prussian army would hugely outnumber his own army, Napoleon decided to try to keep the two armies separated by moving his own army between them. Then he could defeat his opponents in 2 separate battles. To do that, he sent out Ney to take Quatre, which was a crossing point between the road from Brussels that the Allied army would take and the road from Namur that the Prussians would take. With the rest of his troops, Napoleon would try to engage in battle with the Prussian army. When he realized that the French army was approaching, Blücher ordered his troops to the village of Ligny. Ligny offered a good defensive position. The left flank and the center were protected by a couple of smaller villages and farm buildings. On the right, a small river would hinder the attack of the approaching French. When they arrived in Quatre, the village had already been taken by the troops of the Duke of Oranje. Ney's initial order had been to occupy Quatre, to man it with a small number of men, and then to move the rest of his men to Ligny, where they would attack the left flank of the Prussian army. But to take Quatre proved to be more difficult than expected. Napoleon meanwhile started his attacks against the Prussian positions. When he realized that Ney couldn't send him help, he commanded d'Erlon's Second Corps to take Ney's position and to attack Blücher's flank. But when d'Erlon started to move his troops to Ligny and away from Ney's own positions, Ney ordered him back to Quatre. After a moment of hesitation, d'Erlon turned around again and marched back into Ney's direction. As a consequence, d'Erlon's corps neither fought in the Battle of Quatre nor in the Battle of Ligny. Napoleon managed to push the Prussians out of their positions anyway, but because he could not outflank them, he couldn't beat them decisively, and the Prussians could move away unhindered. After they were informed that the Prussians were withdrawing, the Allies decided to move their troops out of Quatre to a new position close to the village of Waterloo. Napoleon gave Marshal Grouchy 2 of his corps to follow the retreating Prussians. Then he followed Wellington with the rest of his army. The Allied army was blocking the road to Brussels. Wellington had positioned his men along a road that was crossing the Brussels road in a 90-degree angle. The road was running on top of a small hill chain that was overlooking the land in front of it. Skirmishers and artillery had been positioned on top of the hill chain, while the rest of the Allied army was positioned behind the ridge. That way they would be protected from direct artillery fire. It also made it impossible for the French to see where the Allied troops were exactly positioned. In front of the ridge were the Château de Hougomont and the two farmhouse complexes La Haye-Sainte and Papelotte. All three of these buildings had been fortified and garrisoned with light infantry troops. From the right, the Prussian army was approaching. Blücher had promised Wellington to support him in the upcoming battle. He had ordered 3 of his corps to march from Wavre to Waterloo. One corps under command of General Thielmann stayed behind to protect their right flank against an attack from Grouchy's 2 corps, who were approaching from the southwest. Napoleon had assembled his army in front of Wellington's position. The battle started with a French attack on Hougomont. Napoleon was expecting that Wellington would send troops from his center to help the garrison in the chateau. That would have weakened the center of the Allied army. At that time, Napoleon spotted the first Prussian troops about 3 hours away from his position. He immediately sent out a messenger to Grouchy to order him back to Waterloo. But Grouchy was even further away than the Prussian troops. Napoleon now sent D'Alan's corps against the center and the right flank of the Allied line. During their approach, the soldiers came under heavy fire from the garrisons of La Haye and Papelotte. Nevertheless, their attack was so fierce that they managed to break the Allied line and started to drive the enemy down the slope of the hill. At that moment, the Allied cavalry rushed forward and broke their attack. The cavalry pushed the French back down the hill. But here the French cavalry started a counterattack against the Allied, who were still exhausted from their own charge. Now the Allied were forced to withdraw under heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the Prussians were coming dangerously close. Napoleon had sent out his reserve and parts of his guard to stop the Prussian army. But his troops were too weak and were pushed back by Bülow's men. At the Wavre, Grouchy's troops had come into contact with Thielmann's corps. Thielmann had assembled his men behind the river Dyle and blocked every bridge that passed it. Although he had considerably fewer men, he was in a strong defensive position and could hope to stop the French advance. At Waterloo, Ney had gotten the impression that Wellington was withdrawing troops from his center. He wanted to seize the opportunity and gathered most of the cavalry for an attack. Behind him, D'Alan marched with his corps against La Haye. After the defenders of the garrison had run out of ammunition, the last survivors had to evacuate the farm. Ney's attack was less successful. The Allied troops had formed squares to defend themselves against the cavalry attacks. Because Ney had no infantry or artillery support, he wasn't able to break the squares and had to move his troops back. After the retreat of his cavalry, Napoleon ordered a last, desperate attack to break the Allied line. He sent D'Alan's corps and his old guard, which he had kept as a last reserve, against Wellington's line. The Allied lines tumbled, but ultimately didn't break. Von Bülow's Prussians continued to push the French back. His troops were already operating in the back of the French army and were threatening to encircle the French totally. At that time, one of Grouchy's cavalry units arrived at a bridge in Ligny, which was only defended by a small number of men. Wellington's right flank got more and more support from Ziethen's Prussian corps. The Prussians managed to outflank D'Alan's corps and could bend his flank inwards. The French were now hugely outnumbered and started to lose ground on every side. The first units started to withdraw and were soon followed by others, until the whole army started an unorganized retreat. Their comrades at the Wavre were more successful. Grouchy had managed to send troops behind the back of Thielmann's men, and was threatening to cut him off from the rest of the Prussian army. So Thielmann decided to abandon his position and moved his troops north. He had lost the battle, but he had kept a third of the French army away from the Battle of Waterloo. Waterloo would be Napoleon's last battle. After the battle he went back to Paris to gather new troops, but he had lost the support from the parliament and his former allies. He was forced to resign and was sent into exile, where he would die 6 years later,